Imagine standing in the middle of nowhere, sand in every direction, the horizon blurred by heat. The air itself feels sharp. Your phone flashes a number that doesn't sound real, 49 degrees Celsius. No shade, no surface water, no birds, no insects, just wind sand and the kind of silence that makes you understand why locals have names like Sea of Death for places like this. Now look up. Thousands of giant mirrors are turning in unison, tracking the sun like a mechanical swarm. They throw light into a single tower that burns so bright it looks like a second artificial star. The tower glows. The air around it shimmers. It's as if someone built a miniature sun to fight the real one. Look down. The dunes aren't smooth anymore. They're stitched with a golden checkerboard made of straw, perfect squares laid out with geometric discipline like a woven net thrown across the desert skin. And on the far line of the horizon, this is the part your brain refuses. At first, there are trees, forests, growing in sand. This isn't concept art. It's happening now. China has been trying to stop a desert that was literally swallowing villages, choking rivers, and launching dust storms so massive they could travel thousands of kilometers and smother the country's own capital. But this story isn't just they planted trees in the desert. It's about what they built to make those trees survive, an engineered ecosystem powered by sunlight, supported by roads that cut through shifting dunes and held together by a feedback loop that turns heat, the desert's greatest weapon, into the very thing that keeps life alive. And buried inside the success story is a secret most viral headlines skip. Because you can paint a desert green and still be losing the war underneath. To understand how China pulled off the impossible and why some scientists still call it risky, you have to go back, way back, before anyone planted a single seed. Millions of years ago, two mountain ranges rose in Central Asia like walls in a cage, the Tian Shan to the north and the Kunlun to the south. Between them, nature built a trap. Those mountains block moisture coming from the Indian Ocean, and from the north, squeezing the air dry before it can reach the basin. The result is the Taklamakan Desert, around 337,000 square kilometers of shifting sand and brutal extremes. Locals call it the Sea of Death, and it's not poetic exaggeration. In some areas, every square meter receives only about 5 liters of water per week, roughly a single bottle. That makes it around 10 times drier than places people already think of as dry, like parts of California. The temperature swings are violent. Summer can push toward 50 degrees Celsius. Winter can plunge below minus 20 degrees Celsius. And the wind doesn't just blow, it moves the ground. Dunes migrate, roads disappear. Sandstorms can arrive fast enough to bury structures and erase the work of an entire day in hours. For centuries, the desert advanced like a slow predator, swallowing farmland, suffocating river channels, forcing families to abandon homes. Then the threat stopped being regional and became national. By the 1990s, Beijing, far from the Taklamakan, was being hit by dust and sand carried roughly 2,000 kilometers across the country. People wore masks not because of a virus, but because the air itself became abrasive. In some years, residents reportedly endured more than 80 dusty days when the city felt like it was breathing grit. And that's when desertification becomes more than a nature problem. It becomes logistics, health, food security, social stability. A country can't modernize smoothly when the land is turning against it from the inside. So in 1978, China launched an idea so ambitious, it sounded borderline insane. Build a green barrier across the north, an ecological defense line that could slow sand movement, protect settlements, and stabilize soils. It would become known worldwide as the Great Green Wall. But the moment you say plant trees, the desert answers with its own question: with what water? Officially, it's called the 3 North Shelter Belt Program. Informally, it's a single impossible sentence plant, a wall of vegetation across northern China. The plan stretched about 4,500 kilometers, running across deserts, grasslands, and mountain edges from near the border with Kazakhstan toward the northeast, reaching toward regions close to the Sea of Japan. The targeted scale was enormous, around 35 million hectares of trees and vegetation, an area comparable to planting an entire large European country from scratch. And the timeline was even more aggressive. This wasn't a 5-year plan. It was designed as 72 years of continuous work with a finish line around 2050. But when engineers and ecologists looked at the Taklamakan and similar deserts, the math looked cruel. How do you plant anything where it barely rains? How do you build when dunes shift every week? How do you keep crews working in deadly heat with no shade? 49 degrees Celsius days without the desert simply killing the labor force. The first breakthrough was almost offensively simple. Straw, not high-tech polymer sheets, not concrete barriers. Straw, ordinary agricultural straw, moved by the truckload into the desert interior. Trucks sank into sand. Workers unloaded bundles under a sun that punished every minute. And then they did something that from the air looks like an artist lost their mind. They carved shallow trenches and laid the straw in a massive grid, a checkerboard pattern. Each square was about 6 meters on a side, repeated thousands upon thousands of times until the dunes look like a giant woven carpet. From above, it resembles abstract art. On the ground, it's physics. The straw grid slows wind at the surface, breaking the airflow that normally scours and shifts sand. It stabilizes dunes long enough for something fragile, like a seedling, to survive its first brutal weeks. It also creates tiny microclimates, trapping moisture from early morning dew for a little longer. Not a lot, just enough. Then in the center of each square, a machine drills a hole. A sapling goes in species chosen not for beauty, but for endurance. Weeks pass. The straw takes the beating from the wind. Dew collects. The sun still burns, but now the seedling doesn't die in the first day. And slowly the straw begins to rot, turning into organic matter fertilizer in a place that otherwise has almost none. Roots push downward, hunting for layers where sand meets more stable material, where the desert finally stops being pure movement. Green begins to appear in the yellow. But the moment this started to work, the project hit a paradox. Trees need water. And pumping groundwater with diesel would burn fossil fuel, releasing CO2, warming the climate, and potentially expanding deserts further. China was trying to stop desertification by doing something that could intensify it. So one engineer looked up at the one resource the Taklamakan has in obscene abundance and asked the question that changed everything. What if we use the desert's sunlight to power the fight against the desert? That idea sounds clean, almost perfect. But turning sunlight into life required something else first, a backbone that could deliver water equipment and people into the heart of the dunes. The Taklamakan receives roughly 2,700 hours of strong sunlight per year, among the highest solar exposure levels on Earth. For most of history, that meant only this heat that kills. China decided to use it as infrastructure. Along the Tarim Desert Highway, a long corridor cutting through the desert, China installed solar-powered pumping stations. The narration describes 86 stations distributed along about 436 kilometers of the route. Each station is packed with photovoltaic panels that generate electricity on site. That electricity drives pumps that pull groundwater from roughly 100 meters below the surface. Then the water is delivered, not sprayed into the air, not wasted on evaporation, but fed through subsurface drip irrigation, sending moisture directly toward roots where it has a chance to stay. According to the narration, this system supports around 200,000 trees along the highway corridor. And that number matters because this isn't a few trees for a photo op, it's a continuous living line. Vegetation designed to defend a road, protect equipment, and slow dune movement. The loop is elegant sunlight, powers the pumps. Pumped water supports vegetation. Vegetation stabilizes sand. Stabilized sand protects the highway and the solar stations. A feedback system engineered in the middle of a place that used to be pure hostility. And the design gets even smarter. The solar panels aren't mounted flush to the sand. They're elevated about 2 meters above ground so plants can grow underneath them. In other words, the panels create their own shade. That shade keeps soil cooler, reduces evaporation, and gives seedlings a fighting chance during peak heat. Beneath this artificial roof, desert-adapted species can establish shrubs, thorny plants, willows, vegetation that can handle drought once it's rooted, but needs help surviving the earliest stage. The desert becomes in effect a solar farm that produces electricity and cultivates a living barrier at the same time. It's the kind of hybrid system that feels like it shouldn't work in a place this extreme. The choice of subsurface drip is not a small detail. It's the difference between water used and water wasted. In open-air irrigation, desert heat turns moisture into vapor almost immediately, and wind can carry spray droplets away before they ever reach soil. Subsurface lines keep water below the surface crust so it spreads through the root zone instead of disappearing into the air. And because the pumping stations are distributed along the highway, the corridor doesn't depend on one giant facility that could fail. It's modular station after station, each one feeding its stretch of green defense line. If one station needs maintenance, the entire system doesn't instantly collapse. That modular logic, lots of smaller repeating units, is the same logic behind the straw squares. You don't tame a desert with one heroic structure. You do it with repetition, thousands of small stabilizers that add up to something the wind can't easily undo. But there was still a weakness. Sunlight is abundant, only during the day. Water demand doesn't stop at sunset. Wind doesn't pause because it's dark. And a desert that can erase a road doesn't care about your power schedule. So engineers added a second layer one that turns sunlight into something you can store. And that's where the mirrors come in. Out in the desert, you can find arcs of heliostats, large mirrors, each about the size of a dinner table, mounted on tracking systems that rotate on 2 axes. All day long, they follow the sun and bounce its light toward a single central tower. Inside that tower is the project's core trick, molten salt. As concentrated sunlight hits the receiver, the salt heats to around 540 degrees Celsius. That heat is then used to produce high-pressure steam. The steam spins turbines. The turbines generate electricity around 50 megawatts in the narration's example, at a reported cost of about $130 million. But the most important detail is what molten salt does that normal solar panels can't. It stores heat. That means the plant can keep generating power after sunset and even through brief cloud cover. In other words, the desert becomes a giant rechargeable battery using sunlight to create electricity not only during the day, but into the night. Now connect the pieces: solar power drives, water pumps. Water supports vegetation. Vegetation stabilizes dunes. Stabilized dunes protect roads and infrastructure. The infrastructure allows more projects to operate deeper in the desert. But none of this works if you can't reach the sites. So China also built the kind of thing that seems normal until you realize where it is: a highway through the Sea of Death. The Tarim Desert Highway slices through the Taklamakan like a scar of asphalt. The narration describes roughly 300 kilometers of road cutting straight through the desert interior, begun in 1993, connecting oasis cities such as Luntai and Minfeng. The conditions were brutal. Shifting dunes, 50 degrees Celsius heat, sandstorms that can erase landmarks. Construction took about 2 years, described as an engineered hell. And the road couldn't be built like a normal road, because a normal road assumes the ground stays where it is. The Taklamakan does not. So under the asphalt, engineers stacked defenses, gravel bases, straw mats, geotextiles, layers designed to separate, stabilize, and slow the movement of sand so the road wouldn't be swallowed. The goal wasn't to defeat the dunes. It was to keep the dunes from winning too quickly. The cost in the narration is given as about 1.75 billion yuan, framed as roughly 260 million US dollars, and the highway opened on October 4th, 1995. That opening date matters because it marks a shift. Once the road existed, the desert stopped being unreachable. It became a platform, a place where you could deploy solar stations, build research sites, move maintenance crews, and eventually bring visitors. Yes, visitors. Eco-lodges. Cultural tourism tied to local traditions. Camel rides across dunes. Camping in places where not long ago surviving a single day was the challenge. And the highway itself didn't end its battle in 1995. A road in shifting dunes is never finished. Sand will still try to crawl over asphalt. Wind will still try to carve new drifts. That's why the vegetation corridor matters so much. Plants act like living engineering, roughening the surface, slowing wind, and making it harder for dunes to reform right on top of the road. In other words, the road and the forest belt are married. The road makes the belt possible, delivering materials, panels, pumps, and crews. The belt makes the road survivable, reducing the rate at which sand reclaims it. It's a loop. That's also why the solar stations aren't just green energy. They're logistical insurance. Powering pumps locally means you don't have to string fragile long-distance power lines deep into the desert and hope storms don't take them out. Sunlight is already there. You just have to capture it. When you put all of that together, you get a strange new category of infrastructure, a highway that needs an ecosystem, and an ecosystem that runs on energy infrastructure. That's why it feels so futuristic. Because it's not a single mega project. It's an engineered relationship. For a moment, it looked like a fairy tale, humans turning death into life. Then the data started rolling in, and the numbers were spectacular. After decades of grinding the narration, claims results on a scale that feels almost too big to picture. It cites around 30 million hectares recovered and points to China's national forest cover rising from about 10% in 1949 to more than 25% today. In some formerly dune-dominated regions, tree lines now stretch toward the horizon where nothing stable used to exist. Even in the air, the change shows up. Sandstorms are reported as dropping dramatically, about 82% since the 1980s in the narration's framing. Dusty days in major areas are described as falling from roughly 100 per year to around 30 per year. And the new vegetation is credited as absorbing more than 20,000 tons of CO2 annually, presented as green lungs in places that used to produce only dust. These are the kinds of statistics that make a project feel like a clean win, proof that a nation can reshape its own terrain with enough planning, enough labor, enough money, and enough time. And to be clear, there is real accomplishment here. The straw checkerboard technique stabilizes dunes and reduces wind speed at ground level. Drip irrigation reduces waste in extreme heat. Solar pumping uses the one resource. Deserts have too much of sun to solve the resource. Deserts lack water at the surface. These are practical tools, not magic. But here's the uncomfortable truth that separates a documentary from a propaganda reel. A desert can be stabilized for the camera and destabilized underground. Because while the green line grows above the surface, the system may be pulling water from beneath it. And in a region where rainfall is already tiny, groundwater doesn't refill quickly. That's why the narration drops its twist like a trapdoor. Not every green project creates a living ecosystem. Sometimes it creates a fragile illusion. And when the illusion breaks, the desert doesn't just come back, it comes back faster. But even the winds have a hidden fragility. The benefits aren't evenly distributed, and they aren't guaranteed to last without constant upkeep. Straw grids decay and must be extended. Irrigation lines clog and require maintenance. Pumping stations need replacement parts. Trees need time, years, before they become sturdy windbreaks instead of fragile sticks. So when the project reports big improvements, the real question is what those improvements depend on: a stable long-term budget, careful species selection, and water management that doesn't quietly mortgage the future. Ecologists have raised a blunt criticism of the Great Green Wall strategy: monoculture. In many areas, the trees planted are heavily concentrated in fast-growing species like poplars and willows. They look impressive quickly, which makes projects look successful on paper. But they can also have shorter lifespans, and crucially, they can draw groundwater aggressively, like vacuum cleaners, as the narration puts it. That matters in a desert, because groundwater is not an infinite bank account. If you pump too much, you lower the water table. Lower the water table enough, and even established trees begin to die. Worse, the land can become more vulnerable than before because you've altered the balance and invested everything in a single biological strategy. And then there's the nightmare scenario: monocultures invite disease. The narration describes a severe outbreak where more than 1 billion trees died across northern China. Years of work wiped out, not by one dramatic storm, but by vulnerability built into the planting plan. Some international studies, it says, suggest that in certain areas, desertification continued expanding even as official reports showed increased forested area. Why the wrong trees? Insufficient rainfall and irrigation practices that paradoxically can drain aquifers, further weakening long-term resilience. So the debate becomes uncomfortable: is this a miracle or a mistake? The honest answer is both. It's proof humans can redraw the surface of the earth. That engineering determination and huge investment can push life into places that look unlivable. But it's also a warning that you don't defeat nature by forcing it into a spreadsheet. Counting trees isn't the same as restoring ecosystems. A real desert edge isn't stabilized by a single species planted in rows. It's stabilized by complexity, mixed native forests, grasses, shrubs, soil organisms, systems that belong to the landscape instead of borrowing it. So China's Great Green Wall is a triumph with an asterisk, a victory with a timer. Because in the end, the desert doesn't care about headlines. It cares about water species and time. And that leaves one question aimed straight at the future. If you had $1 billion and a desert in front of you, what would you do differently? Would you plant different species? Focus on grasses and shrubs instead of trees? Change irrigation rules? Or would you leave the desert alone and protect cities in other ways? Tell me your answer in the comments, because the next generation is going to need better solutions than the ones we improvise today. Here's why this story leaves people stunned. It's not just the visuals, mirrors in the sand, a glowing tower, a highway cutting through dunes. It's the idea that a desert can be treated like a system. You can tune, slow the wind at ground level, trap a few extra hours of moisture feed routes instead of air power pumps, with sunlight store heat in molten salt, and keep everything connected with a road that refuses to be swallowed. That's not one invention, it's a chain. Break one link and the whole green miracle becomes sand again. And that's the real lesson. Hiding behind the headlines, engineering doesn't replace ecology. It either supports it or fights it until the bill comes due. If the project shifts toward mixed native ecosystems, grasses, shrubs, and diverse forests that belong to the region, it can become more resilient, less thirsty, and less vulnerable to a single disease outbreak. But if it stays locked into fast-growing monocultures and deep groundwater extraction, it risks creating a cycle where the solution quietly drains the very resource it depends on. So when people ask, did China remove billions of tons of sand? The deeper answer is China tried to remove the desert's momentum. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it created new risks. And whether this becomes a lasting success or a cautionary tale will depend on what happens next. Not in a press release, but in the slow, boring years, where funding changes, maintenance gets skipped, and the desert keeps doing what it has always done, moving. If you want, in the next video, we can go even deeper into one specific question. What actually survives it longer? In dry lands, trees, shrubs, or grasses? And why do pretty projects sometimes collapse after a decade? For now, remember this: the desert doesn't need to win quickly. It only needs to outlast you.